Hi, my name is Karolina. I am the PMM for business travel at Payhawk.
And my name is Boris. I am the product manager responsible for business travel in Payhawk.
And we are here today to talk about business travel and why it is still such a messy category for finance to make sense of. And we are talking about this because at Payhawk, we're in a pretty unique position in that it's a category we are entering and exploring. And we have a pretty unique view on what works and doesn't. So, yeah, excited to dig into that a bit more. Um, I guess let's start with thinking about what there is currently on the market, what the status quo is. To me, it seems like most tools to do with business travel start with the booking functionality first and then try to deal with the finance aspect later. And we flipped it at Payhawk, right? We deliberately started from the other end. Bobby, do you want to tell us why we made that decision?
Yeah, great question. So to start, 2 months ago, I was at a conference in Paris actually, and it's where I spoke to a CFO who realized 3 weeks after a major conference that 5 different employees had booked last-minute premium economy flights because the booking tools filters were actually easily bypassed. And they didn't have a travel problem, they had a visibility lag that cost them $5,000 in unnecessary overages, and they basically couldn't claw back. So to answer your question, we started with finance because that's where the truth of spend lives. And yeah, the system is fundamentally reactive in most places. And what essentially breaks is the audit trail and cash flow visibility.
That makes sense. I do think that finance have, as a function, have been really overlooked when it comes to business travel. It seems like they get the mess to sort out. So yeah, Payhook is really trying to turn that on its head and look at it slightly differently. But what about an agentic solution in itself? Because there's many different ways that you could have thought about solving this problem. Why an AI agent that can, interact with travelers in natural language?
Yeah, for me, the answer is pretty simple, and it's how we would build any other product in Payhawk. We just ask ourselves, in an ideal world, what will be, having the technology available, what will be the most frictionless way to book travel that is also compliant with the company policy. And in that sense, our AI agent acts as a digital keeper that sits at the intent stage. It evaluates the why before the buy, and ensures that the request is compliant before a single dollar is committed.
You gave that example earlier, Bobby, about when things go wrong. Typically, amongst Payhawk customers or in Payhawk as a company, where do you think this lack of control, where is it most painful in this kind of travel journey? Is it booking? Is it payment reconciliation? Like, where is the main pain point?
Yeah, I think the main failure at most companies, whether it's employees using their cards or a company card, or they're using a travel agency, or there's a travel centrally managed travel team, usually the failure happens the second the book button is pressed without a pre-approved request or a budget check or a policy checks. And it's invisible because most systems treat the booking and the payment as two different universes. Finance only sees the ghost of the transaction in the form of a credit card line, basically a line item weeks later, which is in no way connected to the trip report of the employee. I think that disconnect is basically the biggest problem.
Mhm. You mentioned out of policy bookings. Every company will have a travel policy. I know we do at Payhawk. How do you actually go about enforcing it?
Um, for me, a policy that really works is enforced by design and not by chasing people down after the fact. In most cases, leakage happens when the policy is tucked away in a PDF or an email that nobody reads. If your policy is just a document, it's really just a suggestion. But when the policy is the actual guardrail built into the booking tool, leakage just disappears. It moves the conversation from why did you book this to here is what you're allowed to book.
But could we not have solved this with static roles, filters, anything simpler? Again, why an AI agent? Because that is, a pretty complex way of solving the problem. So what's the reason?
Yeah, well, imagine a flight that is $10 over the limit. If you have a static rule, that will just block it, forcing a manual email to a VP for approval just because it's above, let's say, $10 above the policy. And our AI agent would see the $10 difference, realize the next cheapest flight involves a 6-hour layover, which is costing the company more in lost productivity, and would approve it based on the policy. That for me is the difference between a static rule and a smart enforcement.
So essentially it's smarter and it's able to interpret what you're trying to do with the policy, how to deal with exceptions, when to escalate probably to a human. We mentioned that we are rethinking travel as something that finally serves finance. Historically, travel has been owned by HR, by ops, sometimes by central travel teams. Now, for the first time, we've got something that will keep finance happy as well. What changes when you look at travel like this? What changes when finance finally has this end-to-end visibility?
Yeah, I think the people team and the finance team have entirely different needs. One cares about a traveler being happy, and the other about the integrity of the spend. And when finance owns the flow, travel stops being the black hole of expenses and becomes just another clean expense. You get finance grade visibility. That means every trip is automatically grouped, every invoice is auto reconciliation happens in real time, not in a spreadsheet. I think this is the major difference.
Is there another benefit to having this visibility before booking instead of just getting the receipt after the trip? Why does it matter so much for control?
Yeah, just like any request you're able to manage, for example, in our case in Payhawk, seeing it before allows for the orchestration that would otherwise you'd miss on. If you see that, let's say 20 people are all booking separate trips to the same city in the same week, you can intervene and suggest a group booking or a coordinated event. If you see it after, you just see a very expensive month.
Bobby, you've said that travel is one of the messiest spend categories to control and keep track of. Why is that?
Yeah, I think travel is uniquely difficult because it's fragmented by nature. In other categories, you have one invoice for one purchase. In travel, a single trip can generate 5 different receipts across 3 different weeks. If those aren't grouped together automatically, finance has to play the detective to figure out which meal belongs to which client visit. We we recently had a case where a finance team told us they spend 2 days every month just matching flight invoices from a travel agency to credit card lines in their bank statement. And from my point of view, they weren't doing finance; they were doing data entry because um, their systems fundamentally didn't talk to each other.
One way of dealing with business travel that we're seeing amongst our customers is using traditional travel agencies. We at Payhawk did that for quite a while. And there's many great things about it. It feels good to have a sort of what feels like wide glove service. But one thing we've noticed is that things start to break down as the company grows and as the number of exceptions and manual overrides or kind of manual interventions has to rise as well. So the issue is relying on kind of people and manual work. So why does that break when companies scale?
I think the fundamental issue is the fact that the control relying solely on people is fragile and slow. I mean, when you have 50 employees, you might have a travel manager that can catch mistakes. When you have 500, that manager becomes a bottleneck.
Mm.
And you end up with a special cases scenario that bypass the system because the human is too busy to check the rules. And you always end up in a situation where you just need to hire more people. Um, I think this is where the fundamental issue is.
Do you think people will miss the wide glove aspect of like a managed travel agencies? Like, what's your take on that?
I think you always, I think people will always like talking to people.
Mm.
And I think, you know, I've also worked in a restaurant, by the way. So when I was in university, I actually started a business for a digital menu that you can go in a restaurant. It wasn't so common back then, and you could just order immediately without waiting for the waiter. And I actually hate it because one of the things I like about going to the restaurant is, you know, speaking to somebody and having a real person that I can talk to and I can interrogate about the menu. With travel, I think it's slightly different because you're not just contacting support because you want to talk to them, you want a problem solved. And I think it will take some time, but people will start to trust AI more if they're able to, if the AI agents are able to prove that they can solve problems more efficiently, if they don't have to end up waiting in line for 2 hours for somebody to answer the question. And I think that will take some time and it will require very good execution. But at the end of the day, it's about trust.
The only thing I would add is that we know that travel is a high stakes endeavor in business. It can be emotional. It's a physically tiring thing. It can be an expensive thing. So there's a lot kind of riding on getting that right. Um, and we have noticed that there's definitely a desire in the market to be able to speak to a person. So we always have that fallback. The market, that's the market standard at the moment. We don't necessarily see it going away anytime soon. However, if we can take away some of the pains of the manual exception handling, all the unnecessary stressful bits that humans do as customer service for travelers, if we can automate that and only handle emergencies or moments where people do need to speak to another person because something has gone wrong, then I think that's success because we make things easier, smoother, faster, and hopefully better. Okay, so you've made the point about the thing breaks as companies scale. What happens when something goes wrong with travel, though? We know that travel is a high stakes category. It can be emotional. We have a lot of senior stakeholders in the company traveling always. What happens when things go wrong? Can an AI agent handle it?
Yeah, as mentioned, it will take some trust for people to completely rely on an agent. And I think on our side, our job and mission will always be that the agent is always able to make any change and support the traveler, even in the most critical situations. But to be honest, travel is a very messy category. Not only it's emotional, but it's built on top of a lot of um, service providers and integrations with airlines. So at the end of the day, you're also relying on what an airline exposes via the API. And sometimes you would have and you would end up in a case where actually talking to a real person would be better. And that's why the way we are designing and thinking about our travel solution is we always offer a fallback 24/7 respond in less than 30 seconds precisely for those reasons because we know that something can go wrong. And yeah, that's why we have a educated special travel support team that is able to handle exactly those cases.
I think you made a really interesting point around the inherent messiness of travel, which is something we accept. We can't fix it. Travel is messy, it's complicated. But I guess what we're trying to do is add a layer on top of it that just makes it that bit easier for many people in the company. Again, primarily the finance team, because we exist for finance people. We care about finance people. We know them deeply and want to make their lives easier. But we also want to make life easier for the travel manager, the ops manager, HR, the travelers themselves, who no longer have to remember, multiple pages of a PDF policy. So ultimately, everybody benefits whilst doing something that is inherently a little bit messy and complicated to do. Let's talk a bit about the paper trail involved or inherent in the traditional travel agency setup. It seems that when things go wrong in that setup, to uncover the truth of what actually happened requires finance to chase via emails, via chat, via this and that. Why is missing context the real killer here?
I think the killer isn't the cost of the flight. It's the cost of the time spent figuring out who approved it and why. And in the case of an AI system that captures that intent at the start and carries it all the way to the ERP, I think that's the game changer. The context is remembered, so finance never have to ask, "Hey, what is this for?"
So what you're saying is that business travel and Payhawk is not just a booking tool, right? It's a completely new way of thinking about business travel. It's embedded into spend management, which is something pretty new to the market. Why does it matter? Why is it a big deal?
Yeah, I think when we talk to finance and accounting teams, this is usually the aha moment for them. They Most of them realize they don't need a travel tool and a card tool and an expense tool. They just need one system that manages the flow of money, regardless of whether that money is spent on a SaaS subscription or a flight to Paris. And yeah, I'm glad to be working on a product that does exactly that.
I think this is the key point. Historically, I don't think business travel was considered in the same category as all the other spend, like your SaaS subscriptions, etc. But ultimately, for the business, that's what it is, right? It's money coming out of the business that you want to be able to control, track, report on, and influence in some way. So I think that's a pretty unique way of looking at the world.
Yep.